The Human Genome Project took over a decade to complete. It cost nearly $3 billion. That's about $1 for every nucleotide they sequenced. Today, the same amount of data is coming in every 3 days, and they're talking about the imminent arrival of the $1,000 genome, where people like you can submit a sample to a laboratory and have your entire genome sequenced. This field is changing at such a rapid rate that I'm not going to pretend that I know anything. And everything I say tonight might be disproven in the future. However, the data that has come in so far is very friendly to young earth creationism. And our case is getting stronger over time. And that's not supposed to be true, according to the evolutionists. Modern genetics gives us 3 tools that we can use. First of all is sequencing. We can sequence lots of stuff. We can also take those genes that we can sequence and we can do things with them. Part of my doctoral work, I was blessed to work in a laboratory where I was given the ability to steal genes out of corals, the genes that make the corals red and green and yellow, and take those genes and put them into fish. And I made red and green fish. Now, there's some moral implications to this, but I'm not here to talk to you about Frankenfish. I want to talk about the third tool that modern genetics gives us, and that is the ability to tell a story about history. This is a powerful tool. It's easily manipulated by the evolutionary establishment. But I think our story is concrete. I would like to illustrate the importance of this by giving you a quote from an atheist who said this during a debate on atheism. I want you to see how powerful the story is. He said, "The most devastating thing that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve never were real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there's no need of salvation. If there's no need of salvation, there's no need of a Savior, and I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity." I agree with him 100% after his starting assumption, which I believe is incorrect. He is being consistent, and his conclusion is a conclusion that many other atheists have already reached. But that starting point, Adam and Eve never were real people, well, I'll take exception to that. You see, the Bible, if you just take it at face value, it shouts that it is the history book of the universe. And there are some very bold claims that it makes right at the very beginning that run like golden threads throughout the entire text, unifying the whole thing. But the biblical model of human history is very different than the evolutionary model. See, the biblical model, we have 2 people being created about 6,000 years ago. In the evolutionary model, the most common one today, they say, well, the effective population size of humanity was approximately 10,000 people, and they existed in Africa for about 1 million years and before they escaped and spread out through the rest of the world. These are radically different things. But you see, the tools of modern genetics can be used to test these and to explore which story is more accurate. There are 3 major events in Genesis that we can examine with genetics. That is the initial creation event of 2 people, the bottleneck event associated with Noah's flood, and then the partitioning of that population associated with the Tower of Babel. Let's look at these in order. First, Genesis chapter 2 talks about creation. "And the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and the man became a living being. And a short time after that, the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man." Simple language, with some profound implications. Let's make a prediction. Do men have one less rib than women? Thank you. Of course not. The reason is we don't believe in Lamarckian evolution. We don't believe in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Look at me. What do you think my children are going to look like? Tall and skinny, right? I would not expect that if I took a whole bunch of steroids and started working out and I got to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, that my kids would look like that. If I cut off my finger, I would fully expect my children to have 10 fingers. Children born today, especially female children, aren't born with pierced ears. And if you listened to Carl Whelan's talk this morning, you would have learned that the rib is the one bone in the body that, when properly removed, will regrow. So no, we do not expect that men have one less rib than women. But here's a more interesting question. Was Eve a clone of Adam? So we talk about cloning. Cloning essentially is you take cells from one organism and you grow them into an identical copy of the other organism. And what did God do? He took a lump of Adam's flesh and he fashioned a woman. Well, she couldn't have been a complete clone because she was a girl. But that's very interesting. I want to look at this a little more in detail. People have 46 chromosomes. What's a chromosome? It's a piece of DNA. Part of your genome. What's a genome? Let me define genome for you. Imagine that there is an encyclopedia of Robert Carter. It comes in 46 volumes. And the volumes come in pairs. I inherited one volume, one copy of each volume from my father and one copy from my mother. That encyclopedia literally tells my body to make me and tells it how to function. This is actually a photograph of a person's genome. This is a photograph of all of their DNA in a cell. They take the picture, cut out the things, and then line them all up to make this lovely diagram. Is this person a male or a female? Male. A male, because there's a Y chromosome there. A Y chromosome makes men men. 2 X chromosomes makes a person a woman. Y chromosomes are only passed on from father to son. That's a very important part of modern genetics. There's one other piece of the genome that I would like to talk about. It's not found in the nucleus. It's found outside the nucleus in a subcellular component called a mitochondrion. And those are the little energy centers of the cell. They take sugars and turn them into energy. And according to theory, they're only inherited from your mother. So I am Robert William Carter III. That's my Y chromosomal heritage. My mother was Virginia Eunice Torkelson. Poor girl. I inherited my mitochondria from her. Her mother was Winnie Frances Hurlbut. She inherited her mitochondria from her mother, Weber G. van der Veen. She inherited it from her mother, Rinske van der Vliet, who came from the islands off the northern coast of Holland called Frisia. I have Viking mitochondria. But my Y chromosome comes from Ireland. A man at war with himself. The Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA give us the ability to build a family tree of all the men in the world and a family tree of all the women in the world. This is where we get the idea of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. Now, those are evolutionary terms. They're a little embarrassed that they use those terms. I submitted a paper once which used those terms, and reviewers kicked it back saying, "You can't say that. Oh, they might get misconstrued." Oh, you mean by the creationists? Let's look at this a little more in depth. I'm going to take just 2 chromosomes. Let's just say chromosome number 2. I'm going to color one red and one yellow. One comes from the dad, one comes from mom. Let's get rid of all the rest. Let's ask the question, what would happen if Eve was a clone of Adam? Here on the left, there's Adam's two copies, red and yellow. If Eve is a clone, she's going to have red and yellow also. So at any position in the genome, at maximum, there's only two variations. If Adam's two copies, one said A and one says T at that place in the genome, well, that means Eve's would say A and T if she was a clone. If she was not a clone, then at maximum, there's 4 different types we can have. I'm saying this because this puts a cap on genetic diversity. This is the maximum amount of genetic diversity possible at creation. And it is vastly different from the evolutionary predictions, because 10,000 people can harbor a lot of genetic diversity. Does this fit the evidence? Absolutely. Most genes across the world come in 2 versions. Some come in 3. Some come in 4. Those are getting rare, and most of the times they come in 5 and 6. We can explain that. And some of the ones we can't explain because we haven't tried yet. But this very closely correlates with the biblical prediction of the amount of genetic diversity that we should find. I'm quite comfortable with that. I'm very happy that this is true. Moving on, let's talk about the flood. The Bible says, so Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. A little bit after that, now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah. Notice the biblical statement here, from these the whole earth was populated. It's such a simple phrase, but it has profound implications on human genetic history. Okay, let's make a prediction. How many Y chromosomes would we expect to find in the world population today? How many Y chromosomes were on board the ark? 1. Because Noah passed the same Y chromosome to all 3 of his sons. 4 men, 1 Y chromosome. Therefore, what would we expect about Y chromosomal diversity across the world today? Exactly. How many mitochondrial DNAs would we find? 3, because of the daughters-in-law. This is assuming that Noah's wife had no more children after the flood. The Bible does not explicitly say that Noah and his wife had no more children. So if we find 4 mitochondrial lineages spread across the world, okay, twist my arm, I'm not going to lose my faith over it. But I expect to find 3. In fact, we do. How many X chromosomes would there be? That's a little more complicated. You have to add it up. It turns out 8 X chromosomes. There is, I think, a 25% chance that Noah's wife passed the same X chromosome to all 3 of her sons, which would make only 7. And if Noah and his wife, or Noah, had daughters after the flood, he could have passed on his X chromosome, which makes it 9. But we're expecting about 8. You can harbor a lot of genetic diversity in 8 chromosomes. The point here is we should expect a lot of diversity amongst X chromosomes, a little bit amongst mitochondrial DNA, and a minute portion amongst Y chromosomes. And the only diversity we expect in Y chromosomes are the mutations that have occurred since the flood. Does this bear out with reality? Absolutely. Y chromosomes are similar all over the world. Men across the world are incredibly closely related. No ancient Y chromosomes have ever been found. No highly derived Y chromosomes. No heavily mutated Y chromosomes. No oddballs. Why is that? Because there was only one man alive 6,000 years ago. 4,500 years ago, sorry. Noah, essentially. We also find 3 main mitochondrial lineages spread across the entire world. This leads directly to the spreading event, the Tower of Babel. Let's see what the Bible has to say. Genesis chapter 11, now the whole world had one language and one speech. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. What do people do when they have one language and one culture and they're trying on purpose to stay cohesive? Do they break up into little factions, or do they freely mix? Would we expect the 3 lineages of Shem, Ham, and Japheth to be well mixed in that pre-Babel population? Yeah, that's important. But God didn't like their plans. He said, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Essentially, this is what God did. He told them to do this, and they refused, so he did it to them. How many people are alive at Babel? That has a very profound implication on the differences between races. If there are only a few people alive at Babel, my little smiley faces, and God separated them, can you see that it's possible that like all the red-faced people would go one way and all the green-faced people would go another way? And therefore you might expect genetic differences amongst the races or the people groups. But what if there's, instead of 8 people, what if there's 64 people? And God separated them. It gets kind of hard to tell. But how many people were alive? Well, in Genesis 9 and 10, there are 16 sons named to the 3 brothers. I would assume approximately the same number of daughters. So in Shem's generation, the 3 brothers and the 3 daughters-in-law of Noah makes 6 people. In Arphaxad's generation, about 30, I rounded down. In Salah's generation, about 150. In Eber's generation, about 750. And by Peleg's generation, in whose day the earth was divided. Strong implication is talking about the Tower of Babel. No guarantee, but it's a pretty good implication. I'm just going to say there's somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 people alive. Very interesting that 10,000 number correlates very closely to the evolutionist assumption that there's approximately 10,000 people alive when the earth was divided. They're out of Africa event. But they're completely different numbers. It just happen to correlate pretty tightly. So, divide that into groups, you're not going to find any racial differences amongst people. Think of it this way. If the flood is about 4,500 years ago, and human population, or the human generation time is about 30 years on average. There's one place my family tree goes back 10 generations. It just happens to be almost exactly 300 years. Human females have children, or can have children, from about the age of 15 to about the age of 45. The average of 15 and 45 is 30. Well, if that's true, with some other assumptions in there, there have only been 150 generations since the flood. That means that you and someone from the opposite side of the world are kissing cousins. So just reading the Bible as is, we should expect little genetic differences among people groups. Is that what we find? Oh yeah. There's a lot of genetic diversity, but that genetic diversity pretty much is shared amongst all people around the world. Here is a people group, a race, if you like. I don't like that term. Everyone think of a group of people. I'm thinking of people from Iceland. They don't all look the same. They don't all have the same genetics. So throw into that group all the differences you can find. Now think of another group. I'm thinking of Pacific Islanders. Now I'm thinking of another group. I'm thinking of people from Patagonia. You see what I'm doing here? Most everything is shared. And there's a little teeny bit, in fact, I'm overemphasizing it so you can see it, a little teeny bit that distinguishes us. What we have in common is more than 99% of our genetics. What makes us different is only a small fraction of our genetics. So take that idea. I'm about to show you an evolutionary picture that erases everything we have in common and just looks at what's different. Here's a picture. Someone took Europeans, a whole bunch of people actually, Europeans, Asians, and Africans, and they looked at single letter differences. They're called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Whew, big word. Let's just say single letter differences. They're looking through the genome, say, oh, this person has an A, that person has a T. And somewhere else in the genome, oh, that person has a G, and that person over there has a C. They're just single letter differences. Looking at this, the first thing to realize is this huge area of overlap. Most of the variation found amongst people are found amongst all people. The same things. A's and T's over here, A's and T's over there, A's and T's in Africa too. This indicates we were all once one population. Number two, notice up in the top right and left corner, there's a little teeny bit that's specific European and specifically Asian. Most of that are mutations that have occurred since Babel. Mutations that are specific to that group of people. Notice the bottom lobe. This is the tricky part. This is where the idea that we evolved in Africa comes from. African population. South of the Sahara Desert. North of the Sahara Desert, the people are very Eurasian, European in their genetics. But south of the Sahara Desert, they're very different. Essentially, all of Europe has the genetic components or the genetic diversity of one African tribe. You could take two people from Africa. They could be more different than the difference between someone from, I don't know, Iceland and someone from Japan, between two tribes in Africa. So this is tricky. The assumption is that, from the evolutionary assumption, they assume that this is true because this is the older population. I don't believe this is true. I'll get much more into that towards the end. There's a clue here, though. Going back to my original thing, there's a clue. Something that has profound implications about how to explain the history of the world. And it happens at the end of the chapter, right before the Tower of Babel. Because instead of Tower of Babel, God separated the people according to language. But it wasn't just language. It says, these were the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations in their nations, and from these the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. It wasn't by language, it was by male ancestry. Essentially, God took all the people in the world, put them into a giant database, and said, sort by father. You, father, go that way. This father goes that way. This father goes that way. All the mothers are randomized. I do believe that this is the key. This is such a strong signal that we can still see it today in the world. And it is in the evolutionist's face because they can't quite explain it. There are big implications for paternal sorting. First, Y chromosomes. We already expect a little variation in Y chromosomes because of the flood story, because there's only one Y chromosome on the ark. But now that we've taken the Y chromosomes and separated the population according to Y chromosomal heritage and sent them in different directions, we would expect that any mutations occurring in the Y chromosome are going to be geographically specific. This turns out to be true. Likewise, for the mitochondrial DNA, we expect a little bit more diversity, yes. 3 mitochondrial lineages, yes. But we also expect these 3 lineages to be more or less randomly sorted and on all of the continents. This is also true. Who moves around more in history, men or women? Oh, really? Not according to this. See, the evolutionists can't explain this. They have some ad hoc explanations to explain why, yeah, we know that men are the one who go off on war and go pillage and go, they're the traders and they're the wanderers, and the women are the ones who stay at home, but it looks very much like the women have a much higher migration rate than men because of this. But it's not true. What it is they can't get past this huge, overwhelming signal that was set up at the Tower of Babel coupled with the flood story. And it's there. And so they have all these ad hoc explanations which are not very satisfactory because they won't acknowledge this. Here is an evolutionary picture of the Out of Africa event based on mitochondrial genetics. Now notice the starting point. That is not the starting point. It's not in Central Africa. It's in Ethiopia up in the northeast. Funny because Ethiopia is awfully close to Mesopotamia. I think they draw it like this because they want to avoid the knowledge that we now have that genetic diversity in Africa decreases as you move westward and southward. Just like genetic diversity decreases as you move northward and eastward from Mesopotamia. The farther away from Babel you get, the less diverse people get, because the less people made it that far. But I'm just going to take this at face value. Here's what the evolutionist is telling me. They're saying that there was a single migration of people traveling through the Middle East in small people groups into previously uninhabited territory in the recent past. That's the Tower of Babel story. Exactly. The only thing we have to contend with is the origin, the starting point. But they base their starting point on the area with the most amount of genetic diversity, which happens to be in Ethiopia. But Mesopotamia is about that much less diverse. Lots of assumptions going on in their work. In fact, they base this on one observational piece of evidence, which is the amount of diversity in Africa, and a lot of assumption after that. I'm going to give you a very simplified view of their story. They say that at some time in the past, some mitochondrial strain evolved called L0. It diversified into L1 and L2. L2 then evolved into L3. And mitochondrial lineage L3 then evolved into M, N, and R. Now don't ask me where they get the numbers from and the names. It's a long story. M, N, and R. And those three left Africa and spread out across the rest of the world. I don't know why the other one stayed behind. No one knows, but they stayed behind. This is a phylogenetic tree of the mitochondrial strains within Africa. I know you can't read the numbers, that's not the point. The point is to show you that there's a lot of diversity. Each one of those little numbers is a mutation that separates one group from another. You see that little blue oval on the bottom right? That is M, N, and R, the ones that are found across the world. Or where would you put mitochondrial Eve? The evolutionists put it at the top left. I would say there's a very good case for it being on the bottom right, and that the rest of these African sequences are a product of genetic entropy. Watch. I was blessed with some significant help from some people in this room to be able to write a paper that was published in an evolutionary journal on mitochondrial Eve. You can look this paper up. It's a really cool read if you can read between the lines. Essentially, when evolutionists look at genetic data, they look for differences between people. But I turned it upside down. I said, well, what happens if we look at all the similarities between people? And I was actually able to calculate what I think is Eve's mitochondrial DNA sequence. 86% of our mitochondria are identical. Or 86% of the sequence of everyone in the world is identical. So there's 86% of Eve's mitochondrial DNA right there. And from that, I was able to apply some statistics, and that's a pretty good case. And so when I ran the calculation, Eve came out on top of R. One of those ones that spread out everywhere. And look, those three that are spread out everywhere, 3 daughters-in-law of Noah. And 2 of these things, there's only one mutation separating them, as if these 2 daughters-in-law of Noah were sisters, or something like that. Very interesting. Very interesting. And therefore, the numbers there are the number of mutations between each group. L3, L2, L1, and L0 in my model are derived from N, not the other way around. See, on average, out of the 16,000 base pairs in mitochondrial genome, people around the world only vary by 21 positions. That's not very much, and it's easy to explain in even 150 generations. Most all of the positions that vary, 99% of the positions, at least 90% of the people have the same letter, and a few people have something different. See, the mitochondrial genome is supposed to evolve rapidly. It's supposed to have all this mutation in it. I didn't believe my numbers when I ran these calculations, because I said, where's all the variability? It wasn't what I've been told, and this was a shocker, and somehow we squeaked it through. In fact, a couple of the co-authors took their name off it because they were known creationists and they didn't want to get flagged. After giving this talk, I might not ever have the ability to publish another paper, but we'll see what happens. So what do we do with these sub-Saharan African sequences? How do we take the evolutionist main argument and explain it? Well, first of all, it's a realization that it all depends upon the model. And their model, I'm going to call it the neutral model of evolution. That all these things that are occurring in mitochondria have nothing to do with natural selection. Or that evolution does not act on the mitochondria. Or that evolution does not act on the speed of evolution. In other words, the people over there and the people over there have to be evolving. They have to be accumulating mutations at the same exact rate. It's called the molecular clock idea, or molecular clock hypothesis. That's a big assumption. All you need is one group of people to have a different DNA repair mechanism, or a defective DNA repair enzyme, or one group of people to undergo long-term starvation, which tends to fragment your genetics. Or one group of people just to have different numbers of crossovers per chromosome arm per generation. We don't know the mechanism behind that. We don't even know how many each person has. 1 or 2, we say, between each long chromosome arm. Well, if the Africans have 3 and the Europeans have 2, it's going to have a big implication on how much genetic diversity that population can hold. Try not to go into details. Bite my tongue. See, there's no room for mutation rate differences between populations due to environmental stress, nutrition, demographics, or any of the mutations in DNA polymerase, which we know occur, or any mutations in the DNA copying or proofreading or correcting mechanisms. If any one of those is true, that whole assumption that the whole assumption that the African sequences are the older population is wrong. I hypothesized while I was working on this stuff that, how do I do this? I said, all I need then is the people who go to Africa. See, the Bible doesn't tell us who they are. The Bible only explains the North African population. It does not say where the people in Southern Africa come from. Likewise, it doesn't say where the Chinese came from or the people that were here in Australia before the Europeans got here. We have to infer that through evolution or through genetic storytelling. But I'm sitting there thinking, I say, well, all we need is the people who got to Africa, to be in a small tribe for a long period of time. Because in a small population, you have a rapid fixation of new mutations. You have rapid genetic drift. And if you had several small tribes existing in Africa over time, they're going to drift very rapidly with respect to one another. And then when they finally catch up to their environment and the population starts increasing, you're going to have some radically different genetic-looking people. I think an evolutionist read my mind. 2008, brand new. Bahar et al., The Dawn of Human Matrilineal Diversity, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They concluded early human populations in Africa evolved separately as small groups for 100,000 years. That flies in the face of all of their ideas of the neutral model. If this is true, if there's evidence for that, and the people that left the Babel got to Africa and struggled, we can explain Africa without having to resort to evolution. Is that understandable? Okay. I'm going to conclude with this. Modern genetics has discovered the main outline of Genesis, including the creation, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Modern genetics can be used to address big pictures of human genetic history. I've only just scratched the surface. There's so much detail that is screaming in the back of my mind that I want to say that I cannot say because of time. There's so much material out there. It's pouring in at such a rapid rate that, honestly, genetics has now become the realm of the data analyst. Persons who can sit there with a database and crank numbers around, that's the modern geneticist, because there's so much data. There's enough data now that I could spend the rest of my life studying it and never run out of stuff to study, and there's still more coming in. But the big picture is good for us. We can reach out and claim it. We don't have to run away from it. It's speaking our language. It's reflecting the Bible and the biblical picture. I'm going to leave you with that. I hope I've struck a few chords in your mind. I hope I've answered a few questions. I tried not to overwhelm you with that end part about the African stuff. And I got to be careful with that, because I don't want to say that those people are more degenerate than other people. I don't believe that's true at all. It might be that I'm more inbred, and that's why there's less genetic diversity in my people than the other people. So we can easily throw barbs at each other. Let's not do that. We're all under the curse. We're all a product of Babel. We're all a product of the flood. We're all a product of the Garden of Eden. Thank you.